In this lesson, we are going to move on to the next major topic for this module for A-level history, talking about the emergence of the communist dictatorship between 1917 and 1941. This is going to be the first of two lessons focusing on the Russian Civil War. Now, we're going to explain essentially the main players of the Civil War in this lesson, the various different advantages and disadvantages that each player had. And then in the next lesson, we'll ask the question as to why and how the Bolsheviks won the Civil War. What were the reasons for their winning of the Civil War itself? So we know that following the ending of the Russian involvement in World War One, following the peace treaty that was signed in March of 1918, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, we see that a civil war breaks out within the Russian state. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the actors involved, the events that took place during the conflict as well. So the Russian Civil War began in the middle of 1918, and it would not end until early 1921. So it was a major significant conflict that takes place, almost as long as the First World War, at least when it comes to Russia's involvement in the First World War itself. It ends with a communist victory, with the Bolshevik Reds facing their political enemies, quote-unquote, the Whites. That is the common division that is had when we talk about the Russian Civil War. It's the Reds versus the Whites, the Bolsheviks versus the White forces. So the causes of the Civil War are very, very clear to understand. The Bolsheviks as political opponents were not prepared to accept the absolute rule of the Bolshevik authority of the Bolshevik state. The Bolsheviks wanted ideological unity. They wanted a single-party state and ultimate control over everything. They did not want to have political parties. They did not want to have elections. They didn't want any of these things. They wanted a dictatorship. And so all of the various other ideological supporters of other individuals and other ideological groups within the Russian state did not want to just simply bow down to the wills and authority of the Bolsheviks. Lenin believed that a conflict would destroy his opponents, and so as a result of this, he was very much supportive of it. He did not want to see major rise-ups and major strikes and major assassination attempts plague his entire legacy for the entirety of the communist regime. So instead, he wanted to just accept that a conflict was going to take place and that he was just going to destroy all of his political opponents. Some fought the war to achieve independence from the empire, others fought to prevent it. The Bolsheviks, for a number of reasons, had a great many more enemies. So the course of the Civil War itself is a very interesting series of events. At the beginning of the war, in the middle of 1918, no one actually believed that the Reds were going to win the war. The Bolsheviks were going to win the war. They were something of a minority in terms of ideological popularity at this point, but there were a number of different various logistical advantages that the Reds had over all the other actors within the conflict, which we'll get to in the next lesson. The Red Army, which formed as a result of out of the Bolshevik support for consolidation of communist authority, occupied only 1/5 of all of Russia. They were only occupying 20% of the Russian state. Lenin's new government controlled most of northern and central Russia. This level of control gave the Red Army a number of significant geographical advantages. The Reds were in control of the most densely populated areas. Of course, this meant that we could therefore recruit workers, recruit soldiers, recruit industrial output, economic output, which would then contribute to the war economy. It was also the most industrialized area of Russia. When you are thinking about fighting a war and you're thinking about which kind of economic modality you need more industry than you need agriculture. Okay, agriculture feeds the soldiers, but industry actually arms the soldiers and allows them to do their job. So this is obviously an advantage for the Russian people, for the Bolsheviks, I say. Because it was more industrialized, they were also able to use the railroad system as well. That meant that they were essentially able to transport soldiers all across the empire in a far more effective manner than anybody else involved in the conflict itself. When it comes to areas of Russia which were controlled by the whites, they were very unlucky in their geographical control. Okay, there were far fewer people within the white areas of Russia. Obviously, that makes it more difficult to recruit soldiers. It was less industrialized, there were fewer factories, there was less ability for them to produce munitions. The whites regions were also divided and were difficult to coordinate. So whereas the Bolsheviks on the one hand had very limited geographical expansion and geographical territory, they were all localized together, so they were able to essentially control their forces in a much more effective manner. Whereas the larger areas that were controlled by the whites were more divided and difficult to coordinate. One of the common overlooked areas and issues that relates to the Russian Civil War is the introduction of the Greens, which were actually a part of the conflict that not many people actually pick up on. The Green forces controlled small areas, mainly in Ukraine. Their resources were very limited. They were also surrounded by the whites, so it made it very difficult for them to actually make any meaningful contribution to the conflict itself. Just a nice little interesting addition to in addition to the conflict itself. So the final groups involved in this conflict were the nationalists. The nationalists would control areas in the southern region, touching on the Middle Eastern area of the Russian Empire. So Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, for example. And just like the Greens, they were small in comparison to the whites and the reds, so they're often overlooked in the conflict itself, given the fact that it was seen colloquially as a conflict between the Bolsheviks and the whites. Finally, I want to just bring into the fold one of the major events which takes place in response to the Russian Civil War, and bring into the fold the eventual end of the Romanov dynasty from not just an autocratic sense when he abdicated power, Nicholas II, but in terms of an end to the bloodline entirely, which was with the murder of the Romanov dynasty, the Romanov family. So we know already that on the 2nd of March 1917, the Tsar Nicholas II abdicates the throne and is essentially forced to abdicate following the February Revolution. He had hoped that he was able to get safe passage to Germany or Britain, owing to the fact that he was related to those monarchs. He was related to the King of England, to the King of Britain, and he was related to the German Kaiser, to Wilhelm II. They were all cousins, and so he had hoped to be able to get safe passage out of Russia and to these areas, but this did not end up being the case. The Romanovs had been moved to a number of different locations by the Soviets during the entire period of the October Revolution, and then going into the Russian Civil War. This was essentially trying to prevent any kind of Tsarist supporters from being able to rescue them, and to try and stamp more authority, and to maybe bring back the autocratic Tsarist regime. Don't forget, the Tsars had controlled and ruled over Russia, Muscovy, the Kievan Rus, all the way back to around 900 AD, sorry. So, of course, the idea that the Tsars could be reinstated as monarchs was something that was on the minds of the Soviets for a long time, especially also given the fact that their power and authority, the Bolsheviks' power and authority, was quite weak during 1918, 1919. It wasn't until the end of 1921, that we see a more consolidated establishment of communist authority. But this raised an issue. What do we do with the Romanov dynasty? What do we do with these people? Do we just allow them to live out their lives? Do we exile them? Do we send them wherever? Do we put them on trial, as Trotsky wanted? He wanted to see Nicholas II be put on trial. Lenin wanted to just simply eradicate the Romanovs, and so as a result of this, on the 17th of July 1918, Nicholas II and his family were all executed in the basement of their safe house. Now, this is done in Yekaterinburg, and ultimately, they were told that they were going to be taken to the basement in the middle of the night in order to take a picture to prove that they were still alive. And then when they were there, they were told that they had, in crimes against the Soviet state, that they were going to be executed. And this is essentially the end of the Romanov dynasty, beginning in 1613 with the Zemsky Sobor pleading with Mikhail I to take the throne following the first Russian Civil War, the time of troubles, and ending in a basement in 1918 with their execution. And this is essentially the end of the line for the Romanov dynasty. The next lesson, what we're going to do is talk about the reasons why the Bolsheviks managed to win the Russian Civil War, despite the fact that they were not tipped to win the Civil War at the beginning of it. They were definitely the underdogs in this conflict, and so we'll explain the reasons why they were able to take control, win the Civil War, and formally consolidate communist authority.